Hey everyone, I'm Aislinn, a friend of Friendly City Books, and I'm here today with author Vaishnavi Patel. Vaishnavi has just released her book called Goddess of the River. And just a little bit about her. She is a lawyer focusing on constitutional law and civil rights. She likes to write at the intersection of Indian myth, feminism, and anti-colonialism. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel Kaikeyi. Vaishnavi grew up in and around Chicago and in her spare time enjoys activities that are almost stereotypically Midwestern: knitting, ice skating, drinking hot chocolate, and making hot dish. Everyone loves a good hot dish.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
and
every
we're
time that bio is read, someone comes up to me. Every time it's read, I'm like, I need to get rid of this. This is silly. And then somebody comes up to me and says, I don't know what hot dish is. And so I have to keep it in there to educate the people.
you have to. Hot dish is Midwestern culture.
It is. And like, how do you not know that? How have you never had the pleasure of hot dish?
I think everywhere else recognizes it as casserole, but I feel
Yes.
like hot dish is a different category of casserole.
It's like tater tot, like it's tater tot casserole in air quotes, but there's something more to it. There's
Yeah.
secret sauce, and the secret sauce is, cream of mushroom soup and a lot of spices. I'm not here to gatekeep the recipe. I'm here to like bring hot dish to the people.
Bring hot dish to the people. That is the quote for this whole podcast today.
Okay.
Is bring hot dish to the people.
You know what? If that's what I'm remembered for, I'm fine with that.
So we're here today talking about Goddess of the River, Vaishnavi's latest novel. Goddess of the River is a retelling of the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, from the point of view of the river Ganga and her son Bhishma. This is Vaishnavi's second epic retelling, and her first is Kaikeyi, a retelling of the Ramayana. Goddess of the River is also the first ever pick of the Muses book club, a joint book club with Friendly City Books and Columbus Lowndes Public Library. If you would like to join them, it will meet on July 23rd, 7 p.m. at Friendly City Books. So if you are local, pick up your copy at Friendly City Books or the local library and put that date on your calendar. So as we get started, Vaishnavi, I would love to know what inspired you to write epic retellings.
So I think the the Indian epics have just been part of my life since basically I can remember. I grew up hearing these stories, and I'm sure I was hearing them even as a baby. And so they're just they're the things that made me fall in love with storytelling. When I think of the first like big stories I read or learned about, it was these stories that my grandma told me at the lunch table in the summer. It's such a visceral memory. I can literally like think about the smells I was smelling kind of level of memory. And so I've always been interested in writing. I've always loved writing. But when I actually sat down to like write a book project, Kaikeyi just kind of came out of me because I had been thinking about this character and this story for so long. And I didn't really have a greater project in mind than to just kind of honor this story that I loved so much. I think in deciding to get published, that's where a lot of the sort of surrounding cultural conversation came in, where I realized that in talking to friends and talking to my sister, that so many people were hungry for stories from their epic myths, if they were Indian, or for stories from epics that weren't the Greek and Roman myths that we hear in school and that are, 95% of the retellings that are on the market today. People wanted to read about other perspectives and other cultures. And so I kind of decided to at least try. And I've been very fortunate in that I've gotten to write not one, but two myth retellings. And with Goddess of the River, I knew right away I wanted to write about the Mahabharata because I think it asks such interesting questions about duty and justice and loyalty. And is it better to keep your vows and keep your word and be a honest person, but to do so in service of a bad institution? Or is it better to be disloyal, but perhaps seek some greater justice? Like, these are questions that are extremely pertinent to people's lives today. And so it kind of felt like a natural place to go, because the reason why these epics are still important today is because the themes that they struggle with and the journeys that the characters go on, we still feel connected to. We still feel connected to the story of, love and revenge and pettiness that happens in the Iliad, for example. Yeah. We still feel connected to the, stories in the Mahabharata where people are lying and cheating and whatever, because we see it happen all the time today. And so I feel like it's a very natural place to kind of ripe for reimagining and retelling.
Our origin stories teach us so much. And I love that you have all these memories of learning them as a child. Because I think we carry the lessons that we learn from our origin stories with us throughout our lives.
Yes.
Before we get into the content deeply, I want to talk about the physical parts of the book. So I'm going to hold it up a little bit. There it is. So the cover art. How much of this did you have to? What did you have to do with the cover art? It's gorgeous.
Very little. I was very lucky. So my cover designer for Kaikeyi was still at my publisher for Goddess of the River. And so I was just like, I want her to do it. I trust her. And, she was given a brief. We want it to look like it's not a sequel to Kaikeyi, but related to it. And they do look very related. I mean, I have the little art on my wall of the cover for Kaikeyi. So she came back with 2 potential cover designs. One had kind of a full body view of a woman, and one was the one that we have here. And I just love that how this one here was, because it wasn't the full body, could incorporate like the lotus imagery and have the little wheel earrings, which are kind of symbolic of Bhishma. And so she basically, it was done. Like, it came to me fully put together.
And I love how she's dancing like the river dances. It just brings us into kind of who Ganga is. So also, the parts of the book are named after the parts of a river. And I thought that was really neat, because in case you haven't read the book, the 4 parts of the book are headwaters, confluences, rapids, and the delta. And for me, those helped give me an idea of what to expect in the next part of the book. So did you pick these? Did you write these in?
Yes.
And how did you relate them to the content?
So I started drafting the book without having like parts or structures in mind. About halfway through, I realized I'm a discovery writer. So that means that a lot of times I don't know exactly where the book is going to go. I kind of have the ending in mind, but I don't know how I'm going to get there. And so I'm halfway through, and now I have a much clearer idea of how I'm going to get there. And I realized that kind of unconsciously, but probably definitely from thinking so much about rivers. Like, I was deep in the weeds of riverine research. I had written the first 2 parts to kind of mimic headwaters, this like very narrow story, and then confluences, this like coming in of other perspectives and other stories. And that what I planned to write was going to be very rapids and delta. And so at that point I had the idea of, why not actually separate it out, put the pieces in place, and embrace it fully, because it could kind of happen subconsciously, but now I wanted to shape it more deliberately. And so, that's why the second perspective comes in precisely when confluences starts, because that's where you have a new perspective, a new river joining up. And Delta, we have the perspective shift again, where you have multiple perspectives in a single chapter, and
Mm-hmm.
that's because that's the big change and kind of widening as it goes to the sea for a river. So it was not. I didn't start out being like I'm going to purposefully construct it this way, but I think when you're writing, if you're really immersed in research, it kind of seeps into you, and
Yeah.
you end up often imitating life.
I think that's interesting. But I know one of the popular things to talk about now is like once you've written something, it's then released to the world and people can interpret how they want to. Um, so when I read the section that's titled Delta, I did
Mm-hmm.
it from the perspective of being from Mississippi, being very familiar with the Mississippi River Delta, and how um, everything that has happened in upriver
Mm-hmm.
seeps into the soil, but
Yeah.
also how all of those things that have seeped into the soil affect the life of the people that live there and the life of the people that come after. So when I was reading the last section, I was thinking, okay, this is how all of this is impacting uh, these people and this culture for the future. These are going to be um, the essence of the soil that these lives
Yeah.
are grown on. And I thought that brought a different life for me to that last section of the book.
That's so wonderful to hear, because like that's what I was trying to do. And I think, rivers are, I mean, I've always appreciated rivers, don't get me wrong, but like the process and researching rivers for this book and researching the Ganga River made me realize that they almost function like a living organism in terms of like the complexity and the way that like all these different small, seemingly unimportant parts influence like its course, its health, the soil around it, the people and the lives that depend on it downriver, upriver. And so it felt very natural to have a story that's about this like sprawling family that starts in this seemingly kind of almost ridiculous story of this king who finds two different wives by the river and is like, I'm going to marry them, and how you end up with a war that ruins generations of lives. It
Santanu's choices are quite
That man,
suspect.
even in the Mahabharata, they're a little like he's a little much. Uh, so, but you see how that one thing, which feels like it should just be like the quirks of a single king, ripples until it's like destroying an entire kingdom, geographic area, livelihood, like. And so I think that is very symbolic of what happens in a river.
Yes. And I also think that's something that our book club readers who are familiar with the Mississippi and how the Mississippi has given life and also has been destroyed over the course of its life. And I think that'll resonate with them as they see a river brought to life in Ganga.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I uh, grew up near the Chicago River, which was, famously reversed by man in order to create clean water. And growing up at first, that was always like such a cool thing. And I still think it's pretty amazing. But now you think about all of the like rippling impacts of that, and should we even be doing it's very interesting. People who live near rivers are like kind of obsessed with them because they give you life. So
Yeah. So, diving a little more into the content, both of your books bring a compassionate lens to some of the, shall we say, more maligned or at least more absent characters and voices from their original texts. You've made your main characters Kaikeyi, who is sometimes seen as the villain of her story, and Ganga, who sets the Mahabharata into motion, but doesn't really appear throughout the story, the original text, in the way that you have interwoven her. Why did you decide to write from the perspective of these characters? And this is a two-parter. How did you inhabit their stories for yourself in order to translate them to the page?
So I'll go with why them first, and then how do I inhabit them. I think why them is very clear to me. Both of them are the women that kick off the story. Without them, you would have pretty much none of the rest of the story. But they're also, both of them are kind of, Kaikeyi is viewed as much more of a villain, but people don't like Ganga because not because of what she does to her kids, because she lies to her husband. To be very clear, that is actually there are many people who dislike her for that. And obviously Kaikeyi exiles her son. But without both of their actions, you wouldn't have the rest of the epic. And yet they're kind of there for a hot sec. They do their thing and then they're gone. And you don't see them again. You don't really get their voice, their inner life, their perspective. But they're so important. And to kind of reduce them to like Kaikeyi's evil and overly ambitious and Ganga's a liar who should just like go back to her river is so reductive. And it's reductive of what I think the original writers of the story necessarily wanted to perceive or portray, because in the actual original epic of the Ramayana, you get a little more nuance to Kaikeyi, and you get her as described as the best of the queens, the like most active, she saves her husband's life. Like, you're not supposed to think that she's evil. And with Ganga, she's, worshipped. There's like passages of worship for her because she is a goddess. So I think it was just important to me to get that perspective. And I wanted to tell their stories versus like, say, the princesses or queens and other queens in the story, because I think that they're the characters who get the least grace of the women. Although maybe an argument could be made for Kunti in the Mahabharata, but that's for a different day. How to inhabit the characters? I think a lot of research into both characters and like scholarly research into what other people have said about them and things like that. And then a lot of practice writing. Like for Kaikeyi, I think the voice came to me pretty easily. But for Ganga, how did I like get into her first person perspective? I had to practice a lot because at first she just sounded a lot like Kaikeyi, which was like not what I was going for. I wanted to give her this like distance, like she's a god. And so it was just a lot of like practicing and writing passages that I knew were never going to make it into the final book, but sometimes you have to write those to get fully inside the head of a character. And it was a challenge because I'm not a god, but I had to think like, what would a god think of XYZ, or what would a god feel if they were made human? Because I don't think they would focus on the same things that we would. And so just kind of really trying to think like an alien.
I love that. Before reading your books, I knew very little, admittedly, about the great Hindu epic stories. I did know a good bit about Hindu theology, and I know that helped me to understand the interplay of Ganga and Shiva and Krishna. And since our book club in Columbus, Mississippi, may or may not have people that are familiar with Hindu theology and these epic poems, I wanted to take a moment to say, number one, this book is incredible, even for someone with no frame of reference for the Mahabharata. But let's talk a little bit about what someone with no background context needs to know that will kind of broaden their understanding of this book. The first of those is, what is Dharma and why is it central?
What is Dharma is a question that has puzzled philosophers for millennia. So, wow. I'm not sure I can give you an answer there. But dharma as a concept is in Hindu philosophy. So let me start with dharma kind of means philosophy or like duty, justice, a way of life. Hindus call Hinduism the Santana Dharma. Like we don't call it Hinduism. So it's a very central concept. And I think more than many other religions, especially common religions today, Hinduism is defined, I think, more as a set of philosophical ideals and like practices than as a set of belief in specific gods and like worship of specific gods, because there's people who are Shaivists who are primarily worshiping Shiva, or Vaishnavists who are primarily worshiping Vishnu, or people who worship all of them. Like people have different gods, but what unites them is believing in these principles. And so dharma is, I mean, I think the literal translation would probably be duty, but when you think about it, it's much more a question of like, what is your place in the world? Like, what do you owe to the world and to others? And like your life's purpose should be to like live that out. In the Bhagavad Gita, and I've included this line in Goddess of the River because I think it's so powerful. Krishna says, do your duty without expectation of reward. And I think dharma is very tied up in that concept. It's the thing that you do because it is who you are and it is what you owe to the world, not the thing that you're supposed to do because you like want to go to heaven, which is not even necessarily like a concept in Hinduism. I mean, there's like achieving moksha, but we really do not need to get into that. So people really debate, like, what is dharma? Like, what is the dharma of a particular person? Because some people believe that, you know, it's based on like your birth and your caste and your gender and things like that. And other people kind of believe that it's something that you find for yourself, and it's like trying to live your life righteously and like improve the lives of others and like expand justice in the world, which is obviously, if that wasn't clear, what I ascribe to. But it's a question that splits Hindus, I think. And that's why people in the Mahabharata are so obsessed with it, because nobody can really know what their dharma is and what they're truly supposed to do. They can only guess based on context clues and what they believe about themselves. And so they often get it wrong, or they often act in a way that they think is the way they're supposed to act, when that's in fact very harmful for the world.
Yeah. And that comes through very well in the characters that you write in Goddess of the River, and the way that they are trying to figure out what their dharma is, and how to live within it. And sometimes they do that well, sometimes they do not. And I think that's the question that puzzles, you know, all people,
Right.
is also the question that puzzles the characters in this book.
Yeah. And I think it's what I love about epics, and not just Hindu epics, is that they're so universal in that way. Like we can be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu, but we're all still wondering, like, what are we supposed to do with our lives? And exactly. Like, are we supposed to do X thing that maybe seems good, but maybe could hurt people? Or are we supposed to do Y thing, which maybe won't hurt people, but won't help anybody? Like, what are we supposed to do? I think that's, I mean, most of us just spend our whole lives trying to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. And some of us make a career out of it. And we still don't know any more than we did when we started.
Say, what's your answer?
It's a mystery is always my answer. Tell us a little bit about the gods and goddesses that are featured in Goddess of the River, and what their role is in this universe and in this story.
Yeah, so I think the main three are Ganga, Shiva, and Krishna, which was so much fun to write. I think Kaikeyi, I didn't really get to write about the gods because Kaikeyi as a character is very like anti-god, or like wants to ignore them, and B, because of her role in the story is being ignored by the gods, so we don't get them as much. So we just get Kaikeyi on the gods, which is like very uncomplimentary. And so I was really excited to do another perspective. So you have Shiva, who is in the book, he's like the god of the mountains, but and he is the Himalayas is his sacred place. Mm-hmm. But you have him as kind of this god who is very like he doesn't want to mess with the mortal order. He's just there to kind of step in if need be. But his philosophy is to kind of let humans do what they do, and if they're hurting themselves or each other, like that is the choices that they made, and to kind of let that play out. And Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu, and he has been recently incarnated onto the earth in order to deal with a time of great and coming strife. And so he feels much more that he should be an active participant in the happenings of the world and try to guide the people that he feels are the most righteous towards victory and towards behaving more righteously, and to like kind of, I don't want to say interfere, but like be a voice and a guide and a light among the mortals. He wants to have a very active role. And then you have Ganga, who has recently come down from the heavens. Her descent was so swift that Shiva had to catch her in order to prevent her from destroying the earth. And so she's really mad at Shiva because he like has some control over her. And she also just doesn't know what her place is. She is relative to the other gods, a younger god. And that's kind of true because she has a descent story after the other gods are already there. So she is a younger god, and she is kind of alternately not wanting anything to do with the humans and kind of wanting to shape them in order to achieve certain outcomes for herself or people she cares about. And so it's kind of her journey of finding what is her purpose as somebody really powerful in this world. What does she owe the humans who rely on her? What do they owe her? And like, what can she do? Because sometimes she tries to help and it harms, and sometimes she tries to get revenge and it doesn't do anything. So I'm trying not to spoil stuff, but I think the interplay between the three gods is an interplay between three different philosophies, not just of gods, but of like, what do the powerful owe to the world? Like if you have a lot of money or privilege or political power or whatever, like how should you interact with the world? Are you meant to just be a guardrail? Are you meant to go out and actively shape things? Is there a third way? I'm not talking about like the president. I'm talking about like, what do you do when you are given a lot of blessings in life? And that's something that I wonder. Like I had the privilege to be born when and where I was born, and to like go get a college education and a law degree. And it's like, what am I doing? Like how can I increase justice? And there's not an answer to that question, or I'd probably be a lot less anxious of a person.
Yeah. When I teach origin stories, and I've taught them just several times over the years, whether at the college level or just within the realm of my work, I say that our origin stories offer three things to us. They teach us about a higher power. Mm-hmm. They teach us about humanity. And they teach us about why the world is the way that it is. Mm-hmm. And within those three things, we learn lessons. We learn lessons about gods, about ourselves, about how we should live in the world and seek justice. So I'm wondering about what major lessons and themes from the Mahabharata that did you wish to convey in Goddess of the River? And also, did you add any additional lessons or themes that are not in the original epic, but are relevant in the world today?
That's an interesting question, because I think the answer for Goddess of the River is no. But that's because there is a saying among Indian people, and that is, if a story, there is no story in the world that is not in the Mahabharata. Mm-hmm. Literally, the Ramayana is retold in the Mahabharata. And so it just encompasses like so many themes, ideas, etc., that I have brought forward some themes that are maybe not as present in the story. For example, like my works always have a feminist lens. So I've brought forward elements of the treatment of women and the way that women are often blamed for the sins of their husbands or their children. But there are like some what we would call feminist moments in the Mahabharata. For example, the scene where Draupadi is brought into the gambling hall and is essentially sexually harassed, to use our modern parlance, that's in the Mahabharata. And her kind of being the only one to stand tall among all of these men who are failing her is in the Mahabharata. So I'd hesitate to say that there's no feminist themes in the Mahabharata, even if it's a much smaller part than it is in Goddess of the River. So I think my work was more figuring out what themes and threads that I wanted to then tug on a lot. Another theme is casteism and how evil it is and how insidious it is. And so that is in the Mahabharata. There are characters, I mean, the character of Ekalavya is a great example, who are belittled and abused for not being the right caste. There's people who are refused training and teachings for not being the right caste. But it's not like the Mahabharata is trying to tell like a huge sweeping anti-caste story. It's not. It's definitely not. Like, it is definitely still talking about a caste hierarchy and not trying to dismantle that. But like, I took those themes that were there and then I wove them more firmly throughout the story, where you kind of have Bhishma's character coming to realize how in part all of this is caused by this like rigid belief in birth hierarchy determining what you can do with your life, and how you should be treated. And then there's the big themes of like justice and sin, and is it better to be a loyal, honest person or who does that in the service of bad people, or is it better to serve good people and break your morals? And that is something that is like the central tenet, question of the Mahabharata, right? You have Bhishma, who is an extremely upstanding guy who will like never break an oath, but like he will never break an oath for the really bad people. You have Yudhishthir, who has famously never told a lie. This never made it into my story, but like one of the most chilling stories of the Mahabharata for me is that Yudhishthir has never told a lie in his life, and his chariot hovers above the ground when in battle because he has never told a lie. Like, that is how good of a person he is. And then partway through the Mahabharata, his side is trying to get one of the other side's best fighters to stop fighting. And there is an elephant that has the same name as the son of the person that they're trying to get to stop fighting. And so his side goes and tells this guy, so-and-so is dead, and like your son. And the guy doesn't believe him. So he goes to Yudhishthir and he says, is my son dead? Or is so-and-so dead? And Yudhishthir says yes, which is like a white lie or whatever the name is. And from then on, his chariot always rides on the ground. As a kid, that story haunted me. I will tell you that much. Like that. But like, that is like what the Mahabharata's about. It's about how even good people, in air quotes, are like the people that you're rooting for, do terrible things, and like there's no good people at the end of the day. There's like maybe there is one character in the whole of the Mahabharata that I think never breaks an oath, never lies, never fights on the wrong side. And it turns out at the end that he is kind of like an incarnation of the god of justice. So it's a story about, the Mahabharata is the story of the start of the age of sin. The end of the Mahabharata marks the beginning of the age of sin, which is what we find ourselves in now. So that's kind of the point of it. If the Ramayana is this like fun adventure story about a prince who is like going to like defeat evil and bring his wife home and like unite the realm, the Mahabharata is a story of how we got where we are today.
Yeah.
And so it's grim. It's very grim.
But there are some light pieces.
Yes.
Because even so, Ganga has a whole bunch of terrible things happen to her. Um, I thought there was one particularly poignant scene um, after she gives birth for the first time, and she and Krishna are at the riverbank, and the river is polluted. And she just has this crisis point of like
Mhm.
feeling like she's a terrible mother, which at that point she kind of is. and, but also like holding the guilt of not being a good enough goddess.
Yeah.
Um, but then later, uh, when she is the river Ganga again, she tries to help ease the suffering of women who come to the riverbank. Um, so there's those moments of peace in there,
Yeah.
the lightness that Ganga gives them. But I think that many women resonate with how Ganga feels at the river in that moment. Like they're not good enough at work, at home, as a person. Uh, what encouragement do you think that Ganga would give them today?
I mean, that's a really hard question. I think her whole journey is realizing that she can be there for humans and that they don't have to carry their burdens and their pain alone. And
Yeah.
I think that is like also her journey to realize that at first she feels like she's alone on the earth and she's never going to go home and like all these horrible things. And then later she realizes that this is her home and that she's not alone and that she has a place. And I think part of the feeling of, feeling like you're not enough, like I'm not a mother, but I've often felt like I'm not enough at my job or at writing or whatever, is that you feel so alone. You feel like I am the only person who is bad at this, and I'm the only person who is bad at this in this way. And that is why it is terrible. If you knew that 50% of women were feeling this way, you wouldn't feel like a failure anymore because you don't think that 50% of women are failures. And so I think that Ganga's whole thing would be that she would not want people to feel alone, and she would want,
Yeah.
and her whole journey is about trying to make people feel not alone. And so I think that would be key, because sometimes you feel what you feel,
Mhm.
and sometimes you do like have a bad day or like a mess up or whatever. But like, I think the point is, in many ways, parts of society benefit from women feeling very isolated and alone, and
Mhm.
it's we shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah. And I think that's encouragement that we can give to each other that we
Yeah.
don't do enough.
Because I always like, I feel like I have this conversation with friends sometimes where I'll be like, so like we'll like get on the phone for the first time in a month and I'll be like, what's new with you? Like it seems like everything's going great, blah, blah, blah. And they'll be like, actually, I'm like stressed out of my mind. I like cry myself to sleep. It's like, and I'm just like, oh my God, like I would never have guessed that you are going through this like horrible crisis point right now. So I think that's, I mean, an unfortunate part of being a woman.
Yeah. But your literature helps us to face that reality um,
Thank
of
you.
being a woman and reminds us that we are not alone and that lots of other women experience the exact same things that we are. Um, and I think that's encouraging in and of itself.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna ask a question about the end. So
Yeah.
spoiler alert. It's not a really deep spoiler, but but if you want to stay spoiler free, please fast forward through this portion of the interview. It will probably last about 2.5 minutes. All right. Disclaimer aside, the happy ending for both of our main characters, Ganga and Bhishma, is freedom. Both of them comment on finally feeling free
Mm-hmm.
at the conclusion of their stories. Why is this the way that you chose to conclude the stories of Ganga and Bhishma? Bhishma.
So I think both of their stories, and the reason why they pair so well together, and I mean they are mother and son, is that both of their stories are stories of constraint. Ganga's story of coming to Earth is literally being captured and controlled, and even if it's for like the greater good, it's still probably very upsetting. I don't know. I've since heard, since I published this book, that like there's people out there who heard a different version of the story, but like in the version of the story that I grew up with, it is a story of her being caught. And so there, and she also can't go home. And so she has this feeling of being trapped in a place that she doesn't want to be against her will. And then she's forced to be human against her will and to bear children against her will. And so her whole story at the beginning is about being controlled instead of being in control. Similarly, Bhishma, he makes the vow that he makes of his own free will, having no idea, like as a teenager, what that is going to bring to him and his kingdom in the future. But now he's stuck with it, and he has trapped himself in a prison of his own making, and he could walk out at any time, but he doesn't realize that, and he feels extremely strictly beholden to it. So both of them are on these journeys of feeling extremely constrained and extremely without choice. And ultimately, they both get their freedom, even if it's not in the way that they would want or expect. It's not like Ganga can go home to the heavens. It's not like Bhishma's family is suddenly going to knit itself back together. But like at least they can be in control of themselves and their choices, and they finally feel like they have control and choice. And to some extent, like that is what brings them happiness, like even among the pain. And I think that's a bigger theme of the book, is that like when you are the one who is making the choices, like you can feel you are much more at peace than all of the people, and often all of the little people, or the people who are considered lesser than in the story, who don't have a choice. And you know, I think I'm like, should I spoil this? I mean, so like Karna's story is very pivotal in the Mahabharata, and the reason why he's such a popular anti-hero is in part because of this same thing. Like he does not have the information and the freedom and the choices at the start of the story. And by the time he learns the truth, he is so far set into one path that he is kind of trapped by the narrative at that point, and he's like a doomed anti-hero because of it. And I think that's what makes the Mahabharata so interesting.
Yeah. My heart broke for Karna,
Yeah.
and just the way that he loved his adoptive family, versus like the expectations that his biological family put on him. And,
Right. And he doesn't even know. Like,
yeah.
and the thing is, I think what makes that so interesting as a journey is both sides don't know, and in some ways I feel you see the character of them by how they treat him before they know.
Yeah.
And it's Arjun is like considered this great hero, and people revere him and name their kids Arjun and all of that. But like to me, I do not think Arjun is a good guy in the story. Like he's fighting for the quote unquote right side, and he doesn't do as many bad things as his cousins, but like the way that he treats people he views as lesser than him, or people as he views as his competition, is pretty heinous.
Yeah.
He makes his bed, but Garna's the one who has to lie in it, and that's what really sucks.
Yeah. I was also really mad at Bhishma for just not walking away from the oaths that he had trapped himself with. And I am glad that he feels his freedom in the end. But your writing made me care a lot about these characters.
Well, that makes me happy. I mean, it might have made you sad, but it's good for me.
If you could write a story from the perspective of any other character in the Mahabharata, who would it be? Fun question since we have been sad for a minute.
I know. Oh, that's so interesting. I'll give two different answers. So if I could write another story in the Mahabharata, I might want to write about Kunti or Gandhari, who are the mothers of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, respective the two warring cousins. Because I think I like Gandhari a lot more as a person, and like she is more, in my opinion, moral. But I think both of them are very interesting because, like, at the end of the day, it's their sons that are doing the bad things. But like, even I have complicated feelings towards them, and like the responsibilities that they bear. And I think that could be really fun to write. I really want to see a Mahabharata retelling from the perspective of Amba or Shikundi, Amba, the princess who's reincarnated and becomes Shikundi, the warrior. It's not my story to write because I feel, at least, because he is often portrayed as a trans man, and is like an icon to the transgender community, especially in India. He's often taken as such, so I don't feel like that's my story to write, but I would read the hell out of it. I would love to read that.
Yeah.
Because I think it's such an interesting like revenge story and story of like gender expectations and this and that. In some versions, he is just reborn as a man, but in others, he is reborn as a woman and then exchanges his gender with like a demon/forest spirit. Extremely fascinating. Could be extremely fun to read a retelling about that.
That does sound like it could be a fun retelling. How has the retelling of these great epics impacted you personally?
Like, how was the process of writing or publishing or anything?
Any of the above. So like how have you grown closer to like your origin stories through the writing? How has the publishing of this impacted you? All of the above.
Yeah. I mean, I think from the writing perspective, I have learned so much more about these epics than I ever did as just a listener. And I think I discovered how much more there are to these stories. It's made me understand my religion a lot more and become, I think, a lot more knowledgeable about it. And it's given me a lot more empathy for various people in these epics. I think publishing it has been a really interesting experience because I have gotten such a mixed bag of reactions. Like most of the reactions I've gotten from people in my community are positive. A lot of women feel very seen by these stories and very excited about them and what they say. I've also gotten a lot of like hatred and, crazy comments, and Kaikeyi has not been able to be released in India, although hopefully Goddess of the River will be. So it's just been a really interesting journey that way because I never really expected to get that kind of reaction. And so it's made me think a lot more critically about like my place in my community and what is going on in my community right now. In like good and bad ways, I think. But yeah, that was unexpected.
Mm-hmm. My next question is also a little bit personal, but I'm curious. How does your day job as a lawyer impact who and what you write about? And vice versa, like how does your writing and the research for your writing impact your work?
I think it's hard to say, like it's a chicken and an egg problem in a way. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in questions of justice and equality and power, and those are questions that motivate my work as a lawyer and as a writer. And it's hard to say what came first. I will say that thinking a lot about women's rights issues and women's rights cases and being involved in those things has made me add some, I would say, more like modern connections to my books in terms of just like having more experience and knowledge about specific connections and touch points and being able to see them more easily. I would say that like as a lawyer, it doesn't necessarily affect my work because it's like a very specific task, but it has changed my writing, and it's made me, I think, more of a storyteller in my writing and in how I approach my legal work, which I think it's not like everybody's approach, but it kind of has become my approach. It probably because I think of things in terms of telling a compelling story and crafting sentences in a certain way. So I think both have left their stamp on the other, but I think both are born out of me just being me.
That makes a lot of sense. um, so I know with writing and probably reading lots and lots of depositions, you probably don't have much time to read for fun. But when you do, like what do you enjoy reading? What are you reading right now?
Oh my gosh, I've got like my unread shelf behind me, which is like telling you everything you need to know. And this is like part of my unread shelf. So reading is like one of the big things I do for fun.
Mm-hmm.
I read almost everything. I read a lot of fantasy, a lot of romance, a lot of historical. I love contemporary, literary. I'll read anything. In terms of what I've read recently, I read a lot of stuff before it's come out for like blurbs or like arcs or events. I think this book comes out in a week, but I really loved O.O. Sangoyomi's Masquerade, which is a story set in. Have you read it? Have you heard of
No,
it?
but it's the second book club pick for the Friendly City
Oh,
Books
okay. It's
Muses book club.
amazing. Wow, we did
And
not plan this, folks. We did not plan this.
and
But it's
Caroline actually interviewed her, I think, last week.
Oh, yeah, she's great. We're doing a launch event for her in Houston in a couple of weeks. Like not her first event, but for her book launch. And it's great. It blends Greek mythology with Nigerian and West African history and mythology, and it's just fantastic. It's very, very imaginative and very, very good. But yeah, I do try to read it, not as much as I want to be. I'm currently reading a very interesting nonfiction book called Eve, which is about how a lot of human evolution was driven by like the females in a species
Mm-hmm.
across mammalian history, and it's like very interesting and it's teaching me a lot. So I'm enjoying that.
Yeah. Anything, anything that's already out?
Eve is already out.
No, like a fiction book.
Oh, I just like legitimately don't know what is
Okay,
in and
maybe
out.
maybe this is a better question.
Give me one sec. I like literally have a spreadsheet. Oh my gosh, have I said like the most heinous thing?
No.
Um, I have to like keep track somehow because otherwise I would uh, be even more unhinged than I currently am, which is to say fairly unhinged. I'm trying to think of like what have I read recently that is already out. Oh, I recently read The Ministry of Time, which I think just came out a month or two ago, which is like this kind of like sci-fi kind of it's hard to describe.
Yeah.
But it's about like it's set in the near future. It involves time travel and it's like kind of a romance, but like kind of a thriller.
Hmm.
Highly recommend.
And what is next on your to read list?
I'm currently reading North is the Night by Emily Rath, which is not out yet, but it will be out soon. And it's a fantasy inspired by Finnish mythology,
Oh,
which is
neat.
like not something I've ever seen before. Like I see a lot of Norse mythology and there's similarities, but this is like very different and unique, and I'm really enjoying it.
Nice. One last question, just to kind of wrap us up.
Mhm.
Um, what do you want people to take away from Goddess of the River?
I think there's like multiple things. On a big scale, I want them to take away that myth is universal. These stories are universal. There's a lot of value and interest to be found in reading outside of your culture.
Mhm.
And so I want that to be a takeaway from all of my work, I think. With Goddess of the River, I also want to impart, I think, just how complex these things are and just how much of an open question it all is. Like, I don't think that I'm trying to teach a lesson. I'm more trying to say, here are the questions that are
Mm.
consuming me. What do you think? And so just the idea that myth and history and justice is such an open conversation and that it defies easy answers. I kind of want people to walk away from Goddess being like, I judge Bhishma a little bit, and yeah, I judge these characters a little bit, but also it's just so complicated, and I don't necessarily know what I could have done in that situation. I want to impart that feeling of complexity.
Yeah. I think there's
And
one,
hot dish.
and hot dish. There's one quote um, from um, from Ganga that I think kind of sums up what you said that you want people to take away. She says, "Now that my reach extended throughout many kingdoms of the world, I could see more clearly the way the fate that the humans kept the world going in the face of cruelties." And it's like understanding our
Mm-hmm.
faith, understanding who we are, um,
Yeah.
helps us to understand the world and also have hope.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, Vaishnavi, thank you so much for joining
Yeah. Thank you
me.
for having me.
it,
This was so much fun.
it has been. We have laughed. We have cried.
Exactly.
We have shared recipe for hot dish.
That is so true.
And so that we always conclude with happy reading.
Yes. Happy reading.